Kelly's Taboo Terrors presents Visceral Pleasure and Extreme Cinema 3. I love bringing folks together to discuss my favorite genre of film, and that's extreme cinema. And as you can tell, this has turned into an annual event. So if you enjoy it, you'd like to get involved, please email us, and that's horrorspinsters@gmail.com. I'm Kelly from the Spinsters of Horror, and my co-host Jessica and I have a monthly show called I Spit on Your Podcast. That's where we discuss cult, horror, and subversive cinema with thoughtful analysis, research, and passion. I also co-host a gore cast on disturbing films with the queen of extreme, Zobo with a shotgun, and it's called Our Bloody Obsession. I created Taboo Terrors probably 4 or 5 years ago because I found myself drifting more towards these dark, disturbing, and transgressive films. I also found that conventional horror just wasn't exciting me that much anymore. So once I dove headfirst in the abyss of the extreme, I never looked back. So content and trigger warnings, folks. If you know anything about Kelly's Taboo Terrors, and I hope you know what you're getting into, but if not, I would like to remind you that there will be discussions on various themes and films that might be upsetting to some viewers, such as sexual assault, violence, torture, cannibalism, and so much more. So viewers' dismemberment is strongly advised. So this is panel number 3 of 4 of the weekend's festivities, and this is on New French Extremity. So like the horror genre, extreme cinema is expansive with many diverse subgenres ranging from splatter, drugsploitation, and fetish gore from all around the world. Each subgenre gives us that transgressive cinematic experience that we tend to crave. Today's discussion will be focused on one of my favorites, New French Extremity, less so of a subgenre in and of itself, but more of a decade that produced some wonderfully macabre movies, which span between the late 90s to the 2000s. So today we're here to talk about 2 of my favorites, Frontiers from 2007 and Baise-moi from 2000. So now I'd like to introduce my 3 wonderful panelists for today, starting with Ukraine. Welcome back. She's been here all weekend. Hello.
Hi, thanks for having me back again.
Yes. So Ukraine is an Irish horror film critic, writer, and podcast host of What a Scream, with interests in Irish horror, parenthood, and horror, as well as the possession genre. She is a senior contributor at both Moving Pictures Film Club and Ghouls Magazine, as well as bylines with Dread Central, Fangoria, Horrified Magazine, BFI Online and Film in Dublin, as well as a published author in the Hear Us Scream Voices of Horror Volume 2. Again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And I would like to welcome back one of my favorite people, Zoe Rose Smith. Hello, Zoe. Welcome back.
Hello. Thank you for having me back. I'm very excited.
Of course. So if you don't know, Zoe is a freelance journalist who goes under the name Zobo with a shotgun. Her specialty is in all things extreme with a penchant for nasty, gory, and controversial horror films and books. She is the founder and editor-in-chief of Ghouls Magazine, the co-host of Our Bloody Obsession, and has been featured in places such as Fangoria, Unearthed Films, Second Sight, 88 Films, Tetro Video, Daily Grindhouse, and Scream Horror Magazine. My third and final panelist for today is Kaz. Hello, Kaz.
Hi.
Kaz is a neurodivergent horror lover from Scotland who offers dissections and analysis of genre films as seen through the lens of the female gaze. She is the lead writer for Austin-based horror content creators Morbidly Beautiful and runs her own WordPress and Twitter pages under the moniker Weird Word Witch. Thank you. Kaz is a lifelong horror movie and book fan, and their favorite subgenres include French New Wave and extreme, body horror, psychological, extreme, and religious satanic horror. Kaz has interviewed a handful of actors and directors, which include Q&As with Amber Doig Thorne, Prano Bailey Bond, and Eric Bocchio with London May. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And again, I am your host, Kelly. So, yeah, today we're talking about New French Extremity, one of my favorite decades and eras of horror. And so the first question I'm going to posit to you folks is, so New French Extremity, a decade of very transgressive, interesting films. There's so much diversity in themes and movies. We go from Trouble Every Day, this like art house cannibalistic movie to high tension, more of like a slasher, to martyrs. And we know what martyrs is. So it's just really this wonderful decade of, also when I was looking back at it, a lot of female centric films, a lot of films created by women. So it is a really, really interesting batch of films. So what draws you to the new French Extremity? Ukraine, let's start with you.
For me, a lot of the new French Extremity films kind of focus on pain and suffering. And it seems that it's almost like intrinsic to the humanity in these films, and kind of a demonstration on the way that we respond to this pain and suffering is kind of what makes us. And I guess that kind of I really relate to as someone who's gone through quite a bit, and to kind of see that catharsis on screen. Um, and even with stuff like Martyrs and Baise-moi, where it talks about revenge after this suffering and how it's not always the right road to go down. And yeah, like I've been that revengeful little teenager who was fighting back against anger because of my pain and trauma. And just, it's almost like this demonstration of what we have to do to accept that pain and become somewhat at peace, but it's done in like almost really beautiful ways. Like I know they're quite they're quite grimy and gross, these films, but there's a beauty to them, and I think that's something that really attracts me to New French Extremity.
Thank you. And before I forget, folks that are watching this, we're going to do audience questions at the end. So please save those for, then for the next 45 minutes, or at least from now. Anyway, so Zoe, what draws you to New French Extremity movies?
I really love them because, as you mentioned, Kelly, like a lot of them come from a female perspective, which I think, when you look at a lot of extreme cinema, you don't often get it told from the perspective of a woman, or these kind of female-centric films. You mentioned Trouble Every Day. That's probably one of my favorite New French Extremity films, because it really looks at, sexuality, us coming to terms with our sexuality, women kind of being oppressed. When it comes to sexuality, obviously it looks at like cannibalism. And I think New French Extremity really takes a lot of those themes and unpacks them, in comparison to a lot of other kind of extreme films, which maybe just focus on the torture and kind of the aesthetics of violence. Much to your point, Ukraine, New French Extremity films actually go a little bit deeper. They look at the humanity behind it. They look at, what it means behind these violent acts, why people are committing them. And I really love that aspect of it. And I think as well, they're incredibly bleak a lot of the time, which, as you know, Kelly, all about those bleak films, all about the films where you turn it off and you go, oh, I actually hate my life today. But they do give you like a really good release when you watch them. So I just love the way that they kind of marry that like really visceral violence with actual kind of like deeper meanings within the movies.
Thank you. And Kaz, you again jumped at the chance to be on this panel talking about New French Extremities. So what draws you to this, batch of films?
Yeah, just to follow on from what Ukraine and Zoe said, for me it was growing up as like a female with trauma and not having that kind of release. Like for me, it is there's such a kind of embargo, like a silencing around women wanting to tell their stories. And for me, I think New French Extremity allows the viewer to experience her trauma, to relive it within a safe space, if that makes sense. It's showing these very violent things happening to people, and particularly with women, and it's saying actually it's okay to discuss this stuff. Let's open up an arena for kind of positive dialogue around people who have had traumatic circumstances and a lot of pain in their life, especially from a female perspective. And it's also like the cultural thing about, like with Frontiers, there's so much rich history in French extremities, but I think the genre doesn't get enough credit for. Like Frontiers is about pushing back against the far right coming into mainstream politics and mainstream life, and it's about the underdog and people who are circumstantially at the bottom of the pile, be that from classism, sex and gender, sexuality, being rich and poor. There's such a divide, I think, with people, and I think French Extremity opens up that dialogue to explore these themes in kind of a safe space. And for me, that's what it feels like. You do get that surge and that catharsis watching one of these films. Like Venom Martyrs, you're like, fucking hell. But once you're able to process it, it's giving women a safe space to kind of talk about her trauma and her pain and explore that without fear of kind of judgment. I think there's no judgment in French Extremity. I think it's quite rare for genre film to have that. That's what I love about it.
Thank you. I'll also even add in there female rage, especially with the two movies that we're going to be talking about today. You know, women, we're not supposed to be angry or express our anger, and we suppress so many of our emotions, especially those that would be considered negative or aggressive. So why don't we jump into our first movie then? Thank you for that perfect segue. So the first movie y'all are going to talk about is Frontiers from 2007. And so this movie, I have props for all my panels this weekend, but this movie here came out recently on Second Sight Films, and Zoe and I did an audio commentary for it. And this was my very first time doing an audio commentary. And I remember what was so interesting is that I decided, I was like, I haven't seen Frontiers yet, watched it, fell in love with it. I feel like less than a month later, Zoe's like, hey, you want to do an audio commentary on this? I was like, absolutely. Then watched it a few more times and still in love with it. I have so many notes about it, but it's not me talking about this movie today, which is really fine. Hey, folks, buy this from Second Sight Films, and you can hear lots of my thoughts on it. But this one has turned into one of my favorites. It is so scary and visceral and emotional, and talking about that female rage. So Kaz, you started this conversation off in a perfect way, perfect theme, and what we'll talk about, and what's generally what Frontiers is about. It's like Nazis, right-wing extremism. And I would say now it's cultural extremism. Like this, so much of the French Extremity movies are rich in French history, and this one is, I feel like, really hits the nose on the head, whatever, you know what I mean. It really just gets us into that cultural extremism of France's history, like the history of them in World War II. So let's get this started off with let's say a quote from the director, Xavier Gens. He said that he wanted to show political anxieties through this story because at that time, when this came out, the political climate was very stressful and very alarming and very scary for French folks. So why don't we get started on this, Ukraine, the like aspect of like Nazism, right-wing extremism, and Frontiers.
Yeah, I was expecting it to just be like, here's some Nazis and they're real scary, like Nazis are. But I found it, I really liked this kind of, so we start off in the middle of Paris during these riots due to a president being elected, right-wing president. And you think that that's where the action's going to be, because that's where we expect these kind of Nazis and right-wingers to be, right in the middle of the city. But it actually goes outside into the countryside, and that's where like this real threat is. And that kind of grabbed me because recently, I'm sure like everywhere in Ireland, there has been a rise in right-wing extremism. And it's not just in Dublin, in the inner city, it's been reaching people in the countryside. And I feel like that's where the threat is. It's not just like these tiny groups in the city, it's them reaching people with their ideologies further afield in the countryside where there is more of a spread, and this is where they're gaining their traction and their support. So I really enjoyed that kind of contrast between like city and the countryside, and the threat's not always city based with these kind of groups. I liked the way as well it wasn't like super stereotypical Nazi, you know, it wasn't people walking around with their DM boots and their, you know, like their skinheads. It was like these people look, I mean, pretty normal to start off with, obviously, not as it gets into it, but like that could be anyone who owns a hotel. It makes me scared to go to hotels now. I'm like, but yeah, I liked the way it kind of defied stereotypes, and kind of made me think, well, like, you think you're checking into a hotel with a nice country family, but you know, what are their beliefs? Are they the same as mine? Am I going to be in danger because, you know, I'm a queer person who, you know, is quite, you know, almost left wing? You know, am I in danger? Are my friends in danger? So yeah, I do like that, even though it was like 2007, it's something that we can really relate to even now, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, absolutely. Zoe.
Yeah, very similar to you, Grain's thoughts on that. I think what I love is picking up on that kind of point of like, it could be your neighbor or anyone close by, could be someone that has these biased views. You know, and from the outset, the enemy can look very, very similar to yourself. They can be in your neighborhood. They can be, you know, living next door to you. And I think that's more frightening than some of the other portrayals that you would typically see of, you know, Nazis or, you know, any kind of like fascist, racist, et cetera, enemies on screen. Is that, you know, I think we typically presume that the villains will always be easy to spot. There will be monsters that you can immediately look at them and go, oh yeah, that for sure is the person that we need to be aware of. Whereas, you know, within this film, they're looking for refuge. They take refuge in this hotel, and it turns out actually they've you know, they've gone to the worst place possible whilst they're on their escape out of the city. And I find that a really frightening concept as well, because, you know, again, like you said, Ukraine, it's so relevant now. You know, you can see it, especially in, you know, if you think in the UK, like smaller countryside towns and, you know, certain rural places, they are, you know, they're racist. They've got very backwards views on lots of things. But if you saw them walking down the street and you bumped into them, you'd have no idea, you know. And it's I think that's the scariest thing, that you never know who is the monster. And I think Frontiers really kind of like portrays that very well.
And Kaz, would you like to add anything to that and further what you were saying about what draws you to New French Extremity?
Yeah, I think what what Zoe said about the not knowing who it could be. I think what perturbed me most about Frontiers was you have this patriarch of the family, and you have these the children are quite innocent. You know, there's implied autism there. There's disability, and when you see the real violence and the horror hitting, the children shirk from it. They hide their eyes. They don't want to see it. They themselves have been conditioned into this horrendous kind of like way of life, and that really disturbed me. About you think about it in the UK, there's so many kind of people teaching your kids about casual racism and about hating your neighbor for having different skin color, all these little things where we other people because of how we've grown up, our environment, our family. It's almost like it's kind of out of our control about how we're influenced into these really dark thought patterns and dehumanizing like other human beings. That's what disturbs me about Frontiers, is the idea that an idea can be contagious and you can warp and influence an innocent person's perspective through a very specific set of life experiences and trauma. And that's what disturbed me about it, that idea of, you know, that corruption, I think.
Yeah. And let's talk about Yasmin. So, oh boy, did she ever like, I loved her so much. Her performance throughout this entire movie, just her struggles and everything. But she is this Muslim woman coming into this like very white, you know, Nazi regime in this like rural countryside. So it is a dangerous place to be. And that the scene between Eve and Yasmin is probably one of my favorites of the entire movie. It is chilling, it is devastating, it's just this incredible thing. And I was watching some of the special features on this, and they really did cut her hair off in real time, and that it's just like a very I think crucial moment for her and in the story. So let's talk about Yasmin, kind of like our final girl in this really scary, messed up landscape. Zoe, why don't we start with you? Talk about Yasmin.
Yeah, I mean, she's one of my favorite characters. You know, Frontiers for me is one of my favorite New French Extremity films. I always said I always preferred it over Martyrs. which for years a lot of people were like, really? And I think it was because of Yasmin's her portrayal of like suffering. To go back to your point, Ukraine, what you said earlier about New French Extremity, her portrayal of suffering and what she goes through in that film. I mean, she goes to hell and back. You know, she is a woman that's just found out she's pregnant as well. She's fighting for her life. She's fighting for the future of her child's life, which is, you know, a very good metaphor for obviously kind of like fighting against oppression and, you know, right-wing parties for a better future for the children. And I just love how powerful her performance is in this. I think, you know, she really, really clearly got into that role. She really understood what going to, you know, kind of like the worst places of I guess, you know, suffering would be, and she really like depicts that very, very well. And this, you know, some of the scenes at the end, which is in the rain, in the blood, with the mud and the blood, and she's just screaming, and it's like, wow, I have not seen someone portray so many emotions and feelings in like one kind of frame before. That's like one of my favorite scenes from any film. I just like, it's just incredible.
Yeah, it's you know, trying to put yourself in her shoes. So she's fleeing from the city where, as a Muslim woman, it is a very dangerous place for you to be, and then running into Nazis. And it's like, I am absolutely still in danger. And like, I feel like she portrays the mental, emotional, spiritual, physical trauma and abuse of all of these different layers of her life and what's going on, like moment by moment. I think she does an incredible job. Ukraine, Yasmin, thoughts, feelings.
I adore her. Like, she's one of my favorite final girls, and I feel like even from the get-go her performance is amazing. I mean, a lot of the time with, let's say, American films with final girls, even though they're going through like the roughest time imaginable, they're still like, I've got to be pretty and I've got to be quiet, and there's still this kind of like societal pressure on them to act a certain way, even though they're literally fighting for their lives. Whereas I feel like Yasmin, even from the get-go, when her brother dies, it's this like guttural, visceral, like she's letting everything out. She's screaming, she's crying, she's shouting, and it's just this real, almost animalistic reactions to what she's going through, which is like, I feel would be a normal reaction. And it's not just those moments, but it's the times like the moment you were talking about where she gets her hair cut off, and even though she's quiet, she's still, you can see like so many emotions, so much pain, because in that moment she's being stripped away of her identity, as a way of being kind of brought into this cult, this Nazi group. I mean, for so many people, hair is part of their cultural and heritage identity. And it's just in that moment, like that was the most haunting moment for me. And the fact that she can go from being guttural, visceral, aggressive, and then do moments like that, like that's incredible.
Absolutely agreed. Kaz, thoughts on Yasmin?
Yeah, I would agree with what's been said. She's a total badass. But what really struck me about her, especially her performance, the actor, was the stages of trauma she goes through. It's shockingly realistic, shockingly. From her little hand switches to her head movements, she embodies trauma, so viscerally and realistically. And again, I think with Yasmin, despite everything she goes through, her spirit is so strong. Yasmin is all about her autonomy. I mean, the film opens up with her little monologue talking about how could I bring a child into this world? At the end of the day, it's my choice. And for her, the mechanisms of the plot seek to kind of take that choice away from her. And again, that reflects what's happening in America and across the world right now. Strange men deciding what women do with their bodies, what women can't do with their bodies. So Yasmin just embodies everything about liberation, female bodily autonomy. I could go on for days about her. She's just absolutely incredible. And yeah, I've never seen such a realistic depiction of someone going through trauma. And to think about what she's going through as a character, she's literally fighting for her life as her body's kind of sabotaging her. Our nervous system, you go through trauma, your nervous system shuts down, you lose control of your bodily movements. She's literally fighting against her own body, her own mind, all to kind of keep going and to ensure the life of her baby is okay. It's insane. Never seen such a depiction, especially from a female. It's just awesome. And seeing a female, like, yeah, shave off my hair, cover me in blood, cover me in mud, strip me. She just goes through that actor, goes through the ringer. Like, she really commits to that part. And I think it absolutely is reflected in their performance.
Agreed. Any follow-ups, any other thoughts on Frontiers? Green, was that a first time watch for you?
It was, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So yeah, I watched it this morning and I was just absolutely floored by it.
Yeah.
So
right?
it's if I almost want to watch it straight away again.
Yeah.
I'm like, maybe I should spend tonight watching it again. So yeah.
Yeah, I get that. I felt the same way after watching. I was like, what did I just experience? I was like, you know, it's I feel like it's not that common for me these days to have that kind of feeling after watching a movie, but I really did with this. And so I'm like, Zoe, this is one of my favorites as well, more so than Martyrs. It's just a quick thing before we move on to the next movie. And this may not irk anybody else, but I still have people that say, "Oh, Frontiers is like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, like French version." I was like, "Oh, no. Is anybody else irked by that?"
Yeah, I
bit,
think.
yeah.
Yeah, I feel like, because like I said, like I feel like Frontiers has never really had as much appreciation in the new French Extremity world. Like, it's one of
Agreed.
the films that kind of like slipped under the radar, whereas you
Yes.
know, everyone talks about Martyrs. There's obviously lots of other great new French Extremity films, but it was always like, yeah, Frontiers for some reason seemed to get like this bad rep, which I think actually, you know, when you look at it, when you watch it, when you, as you mentioned as well, consider like Yasmin and Trauma and all of those things, like, it's a fucking amazing film, like, so good.
I want to say as well, there's some really actually, like, we think about like the subtextual scariness of it, but there's actually some really like visceral kind of straight up horror moments. Like, for me personally, the bit where they're crawling through that tiny tunnel, like that made me want, like, for some reason I have this fear of being trapped in tiny tunnels. Not that I'd be going through tiny tunnels much, but maybe it's all like Freudian about birth canals. Well, anyway, that bit freaked the hell out of me. I was just like, "Ugh." And even when, you know, he's in like the meat locker and, you know, one of the corpses opens their eyes, like there's some actual scary moments in this.
Yes, I agree. All right, let's move on to our next movie, Baise-moi from 2000. So this one was a newer watch for me, and I absolutely fell in love with it. So I've had to make myself a top 4 new French Extremity films. Whatever, it's a top 4. But this one was a very controversial release when it came out. It contained sexual assault, unsimulated sex scenes, including the sexual assault that is in it. You know, women freely committing crimes, perpetrating violence and murder. There's a menstrual blood scene. Ooh, scandalous. But also it's a movie about sex workers, starring actual sex workers. So it is an incredible movie about, I think Kaz kind of hit on this too, like friendship, gender, class, race politics over in France. So let's talk about Baise-moi. Kaz, do you want to start us off on talking about this movie?
Sure. So Baise-moi is an interesting one. The title Baise-moi, it translates to "fuck me." So the thing about Baise-moi, as you said, there's unsimulated sex in it, but it's kind of made by sex workers for sex workers, I feel. So I'll get into that. Like,
Right.
when the film opens, there's a title card and it says Visa d'exploitation. And in France, the Visa d'exploitation is basically a way of releasing a movie which is unable to be censored. It's been banned outright. It would be given like an X rating. But at the time in France, at the turn of the century, that didn't exist. So they literally brought in this way to release the film without releasing it officially. And I think the thing with Baise-moi, which was so shocking to people and got it barred in so many countries, was the unsimulated sex scenes with the sexual assault, with the abuse. It's presented so matter of factly. Like, for these women, sex is it's monetary. It's just a way to get from point A to point B to get up at the end of the day to survive, basically. And Baise-moi, sorry, sorry, I'm kind of clamping up. Yeah, so Baise-moi, it focuses on Manu and Nadine. They meet each other through circumstance. Now, Manu and Nadine have both been involved in the sex work industry. Both have been starring in porn films on screen and in their personal life. So there's kind of like a nonchalant way that Manu goes through life. Like when she's sexually assaulted, it's absolutely brutal. It's so difficult to watch. I think the fact that it's insinuated is what kind of rubbed a lot of people up the wrong way. But when our friend asks her, how could you just do that? How can you just roll over and let them do that to you? And her response was so kind of shocking and so succinct. She says, you can't prevent anyone from entering my pussy. So I left nothing precious in there for them. Like that absolutely broke my heart. And the thing about Baise-moi is these women, the sex, the abuse, the trauma that we're going through, it's just every day to them. Because of their classism, because they're poor, we're living on fringes of society, they're queer, they're not quite, they don't have that support system that maybe someone from a middle class background would have. They don't have that support system that maybe someone living out in the Paris suburbs would have, or living in the city centre, in the kind of ghetto areas, and they're dealing with these everyday kind of events which are just everyday to them. And I think the disturbing thing about Baise-moi is bringing that to like a wider international audience and just showing this happens every day to women, especially to people working in the sex industry. It's so shocking to people because they can't accept that in our reality this stuff happens. It happens to people and it's unfair and it's shitty. But Baise-moi is about these women kind of finding a way to survive despite their trauma and to survive despite being told you have no autonomy, you have no say over what happens to your body, and your well-being is decided at the hands of strange men. Again, it's this running theme, which I think is so rampant in French extremity, and it kind of makes you wonder why. It makes you question why is this?
A really great book, which is really like, I think the only book written really specifically about New French Extremity. It's by Alex West, who's a Torontonian here, a Canadian. I own it. So it's called Films of the New French Extremity, Visceral Horror and National Identity. I agree. I forget who said it, but like it's such an underrated subgenre or decade of films. And there's it's very underrated, a lot of interesting movies, a lot of rich history. But I was rereading the chapter that has Baise-moi in it, and Alex West had brought up that apparently in the 90s, there was actually a rise in gang rapes in France. So we see that, in this movie, and that comes back to, this movie being kind of about two women kind of taking back their power in a society where they shouldn't have any. And of course it goes to like, violence and murder and mayhem and stuff like that. But it's a movie, but also that's kind of the catharsis and rage that it's just being manifested in those areas. And I just find it such a powerful movie. Zoe, what are your thoughts with Baise-moi?
Yeah, it's a controversial film for many reasons, and it's a really tough watch. I would say it's probably one of the New French Extremity films that I came to later. I put it off for a while because I knew that it was going to be quite a difficult watch. And I'd read a lot of varying opinions on it online, which is, I think, just because of the fact it has like unsimulated sex in it. I would say that, some of the reviews kind of take them with a pinch of salt, because I think they kind of miss the point of what Baise-moi is about. But yeah, it's a tough watch. Those kinds of opening scenes are very disturbing. They're very upsetting. They're pretty harrowing. I do like the way that the film goes through this element of revenge and watching, the women get their kind of revenge and rage and get back at, these men that they have been wronged by in the past. But at the same time, there's obviously a lot around that it's not necessarily a path that's good for them either. It's kind of like they are on a self-destructive, self-sabotage path which in some ways, you know, will often feel cathartic, but there's a heavy sadness that comes with what they're doing. It never feels like they fully reach a point where they are satisfied with the outcomes of their actions. It's more that they have this kind of, you know, built up rage at these, you know, at these men that have wronged them, that have hurt them in the past. And so they're just kind of, you know, they're using them how the men have always used them, but it's not something that they get out of either. It's an interesting film because of the fact that it's made by, you know, sex workers, and it does feature unsimulated sex, but I like that aspect of it because I think it brings, you know, a very important perspective to the film. It makes it feel very authentic and genuine in its narrative and storytelling point of views, which I think, you know, if it had been told perhaps from, you know, a male perspective or from people that are not sex workers, I think it could have come across in a slightly problematic way. So I like that I mean, it is bold filmmaking, and that's what, you know, that's what New French Extremity is about. It pushes boundaries, and for me, you know, Baise-moi is one of the films that does exactly what it should be doing in that realm.
Ukraine. Was this the first time watch for you?
So no,
Okay.
I have this weird thing. Like, so back in college, I had a boyfriend, and I went through one of his hard drives once because he had a bunch of movies, and it was on one of these, loads of dodgy films on there. But I hadn't really thought. I think, you know, I was kind of stupid in college, so it kind of just went out of my mind as like that weird sex film. But going back to it, obviously now with a non-ignorant mind, I liked this depiction, and maybe I completely took this up the wrong way, but I felt there was almost a commentary on good rape victims, bad rape victims. It's something we see a lot in rape revenge, especially American rape revenge, that the rape victim is like innocent and she's just a good girl trying to do this, that, and that, which, you know, yes, a very valid victim. But in society, there is a stigma on sex workers and almost this like ignorant belief that they can't be assaulted because they work in the industry of sex. And I feel like Baise-moi was kind of commenting on that, and almost defying society's expectations of what a victim should be and should present themselves as afterwards. There's a scene where they go to the fuck club or the sex club, and a guy, you know, tries to fill Manu up, and he's like, what do you think you're doing? You know, you're in a sex club. And it was just, for me, that was a real moment that, you know, she turned around and was like, just because I am in this industry or in an environment does not mean I owe you anything. And even though like it's a horrible scene, but for me, there was like that slight thing, catharticism, especially as well when they're at the slots and there's this creepy guy just hanging around, and then, you know, they lure him back, and he freaks out because she throws up on him, and she's like, you're a creepy guy, like you came to us, you picked the wrong people, shit's on you. And I just felt it was such like a cathartic movie for anyone who has ever been in those situations or has ever, you know, been around sex work or any sort of like just being in a feminine body. And so, yeah, I mean, I read a lot of reviews about it. Oh, it's like sloppy and the sex and blah, blah, blah. But I really feel like people completely missed the point of it. And yeah, I, like Zoe said, I really appreciated that it was done by sex workers, and it could have gone completely the other way if it wasn't done by sex workers. But yeah, I actually think it's a really important piece of media when we are talking about misogyny, gender power dynamics, and sex work.
Thank you. Zoe or Kaz, any follow-up to that? Anything to say?
I think when, like, Carly, the director, was questioned about it, and they said to her, this is just porn. And she says, well, no, the whole point of porn is it makes you want to masturbate. If you're masturbating to my movie, there's something very wrong with your psychology. And I thought that was really clever, because just because these people are involved in the sex industry, there's still that thing like, oh, well, they don't have consent. Of course they have consent. Somebody putting their hands on you without your permission, again, it's taking my autonomy, it's taking my consent. So to assume that this is just a feel-good, sexy movie, then if you're actually questioning that as a journalist, I really worry about your psychology, because it's like, and again, with the unsimulated sexual assault scenes, look at mainstream porn now, look at mainstream porn back in the 90s, back in the 2000s, that rape kink has always been there, it's always been prevalent. And Baise-moi is just asking you, is putting you in that uncomfortable place, does this turn you on? Then why? You know, it's like, it's depicting traumatic sexual experiences, and it's asking the audience, do you find this sexy? Because if you do, maybe seek some therapy or something. So I really liked that. Again, it's all by sex workers for sex workers, and it raises the question: where are these people's protection? You know, you go to the police. Oh, I was raped. Yeah, but you're a sex worker. It's like there's that messaging, with all the kind of characters on the periphery who are dealing with Manu and dealing with Nadine, especially that American perspective. Like Manu's brother asks her when he realizes she's been assaulted. He asks her, "Well, you must have enjoyed it. You don't seem that bothered." And again, it's just that ignorance around traumatic experiences, how people react to sex, how people react to trauma. You're not always in control of how your body will react to a certain situation, especially if it's sexual. And I thought that was a really interesting way to bring up the messaging of kind of grooming into that as well. It is grooming. It's kind of Manu and Nadine are grooming their own bodies to kind of sustain these really traumatic, fucked up experiences because that's all they know how to do to survive. So who are we to say they don't have consent or they don't have autonomy because they're in this type of work? Of course they do. And I think that if you come away from Baise-moi and you don't get that kind of messaging behind it, maybe go back and watch it again and look at it from a different perspective. Yeah.
Thank you very much for all of your insight. So I'm going to move on into our next question. So since we're here, we all love New French Extremity. What other New French Extremity movies do you recommend? Like, what's your top 3 or top 4 and why? Zoe, besides Frontiers?
Aside from Cheers, obviously Trouble Every Day is one of my very, very favorites. I just love films that look at like sexuality through cannibalism. I'm sure I've spoken, you, Graham, we've spoken about we've spoken about a lot about cannibalism and sex, and Kelly, we also recorded an episode together on Trouble Every Day as well. And I just love flesh eating, you know, the consumption of flesh too.
We love a good bit of cannibalism.
Absolutely.
So that film, I also love In My Skin. That for me is a real, like, one of my favorite New French Extremity films. I just feel like it really talks about coming to terms with your own body, you know, like body identity, body dysmorphia, feeling very alone and isolated in the world. Like, it really hits very hard. And then something probably a bit more recent, which is still obviously within there, is of course Raw. I think, again, going back to that kind of aspect of cannibalism and sexuality, like, I would love to see Trouble Every Day and Raw paired together on a big screen. I think that would be like an amazing double bill to watch.
Nice. Ukraine, top 4, top 3. What are your favorites and why?
I really like Il, or Them in English. It was kind of the before The Strangers was a thing. I think it's really disturbing. Obviously, I don't want to spoil the end. I think the ending is quite disturbing and is a good commentary on desensitization of violence amongst youth. I know High Tension gets a lot of slack, but I really enjoy High Tension. It was the very first New French Extremity film I ever saw. It really messed me up as a little 18-year-old. So that will always have a special place in my heart. I do like the way it deals with self-image and identity, especially from the lens of a queer woman. I also like Raw, as well as Titan. I think that's really messed up the car scene. Just, pinnacle.
Thank you. Kaz, how about you? Anything maybe that's hasn't been mentioned yet, or, you know, similar kind of favorites?
Yeah, I mean, Martyrs goes without saying, but Inside's another good one with Beatrice Dahl from Trouble Every Day. She's just, my God, she's so raw and animalistic in it. She's terrifying. That's a really good film. And again, it's put in it's kind of like a home invasion movie with a really sinister twist, and it's putting the twist on, again, being a a female character being the most vile, despicable, frightening fucking person you'd want to find at your doorstep on Christmas Eve. Great Christmas movie, recommend it. There's also I love TTN. The thing about TTN, I loved the kind of gender politics in it and the gender dysphoria that the main character goes through, and how it takes the idea of transsexuality and feeling alien with in your own body, and it just gives it that powerful punch. And I think as a viewer, whether you've had experience with gender identity or not, it puts you in those shoes, and I think that's so rare. And then any kind of film I mean, it's not a mainstream movie, but it was shown in the cinemas in Scotland, and I love that films like that still get screened in theaters. So TTN, yeah, that's a real head fuck of a movie. I also love Irreversible. Love's a Strange Word. It's probably the most difficult film I've watched yet, from French Extremities. Irreversible starts. It's not filmed. It's not filmed sequentially. So the film opens at the climax of the story, and it's the most horrific, heart-wrenching, hopeless climax, and then it works its way back to the start. So as the film progresses, you get an insight into these characters' lives and their love and their kinship, and I think that's what makes it all the more soul-destroying when you get to the end of the film, because you know what lies in wait for them. Yeah, Jasper Noe, the things he does with camera work, the angles in Irreversible, it makes you feel physically sick. He uses like binaural beats, but he turns them up to like 90. So the film itself, the technical aspects of it make you feel physically stressed out and anxious. And that's aside from the story and what happens to the characters. So I would definitely recommend that. And young Vincent Cassel, can't be young, he's just awesome. Yeah.
Thank you. Incredible movies overall. Thank you for recommending those and talking about them. So let's move over to audience questions. So folks that are watching, please ensure you get your questions in now. I know we have a few from Jess, our tech gremlin today in the background and behind the scenes. She has some questions. So yeah, let's start with that. For someone first getting into New French Extremity, what films do you think would be a good starting point? So films that aren't going to scare people away. Grain, do you have like maybe one or two that you think are a great starting point, like intro to New French Extremity?
I don't know. I feel like whatever you watch of the New French Extremity, like it's gonna scare you, because that's the point. Like, you know, you're not going in for a fairy tale. Maybe High Tension, I think, might be a good starting point. It's not as, I mean, it is graphic, it is violent, but it's not as bad. I don't know. I'd say just grab it by the balls and just dive in with like Martyrs. Just do it. Like,
just go in.
Just do it.
Zoe?
So I would be the same. I'd say just fucking go for Martyrs. Although I did show, so I showed my ex-boyfriend Martyrs, and he hadn't seen any New French Extremity, and I was like, let's just go for Martyrs. Yeah, he curled up in a ball afterwards, and I was like, what did you think? And he went, we'll talk about this tomorrow. So, but you know, I think sometimes with films like this, like, if you're going to go for it, when you're looking at films that are just going to be, they're all very violent, they're all very bleak, like, you may as well just discover what you're going to get yourself in for. Because, you know, I would maybe say you could start with something like Raw, because I think it's maybe a bit more gentler. But then, you know, if you're going to go to Raw and then quickly go on to something like, you know, Irreversible or Martyrs, you're going to get a slap in the face either way. So yeah, I'm the same as you, Grain. Just go for
it. Fair. Kaz, how about you? What do you think?
I would agree with those sentiments. I mean, if you really want to maybe test the waters, it's not, I mean, it's French Nouvelle, so it's new wave, but La Haine with Vincent Cassel. That's about, it's not a horror film, but it's about the Parisian riots with it's very similar to Frontiers. It's young, like, Muslim and Algerian kind of French people, and just the horrors, the everyday horrors we need to deal with. And then maybe work your way up to T10 would be a good one, especially if you've got an interest in trans activism, gender dysphoria, sexual politics, female autonomy. It covers all these bases in such a quite a delicate way, I think, without seeking to shock or seeking to other those members of the audience. It's just putting it on a kind of platform for everyone to experience. And I think that's a good thing. So TTN would be a good one. Top of my head, what else? Yeah, Trouble Every Day. That's a really good. It is a really good thriller drama. The horrific stuff is kind of it's in the background till it isn't. So that might be a good way to kind of ease your way into French cannibal movies. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, I'd agree with a lot of these the sentiments. And yeah, folks, make sure you get your questions in. I definitely do have one other one again from Jess. So she's asking, do you think historical context about France helps to inform watching these films? Zoe, I'll start with you on that one.
I'm going to say no, because I mean, I wouldn't say I'm the most clued up on French history whatsoever. And I think you can still find out enough from these films and get something out of these films without knowing all of the historical context. I think, you know, Kelly, you obviously look at a lot of like cultural extremism films, and, you know, I know that you do some research, but, you know, like lots of those films I've also seen, and many of them I've not, you know, I don't know the history of like Chile when we're looking at like something like Trauma, or, you know, a Serbian film. I don't know all of the history around that, but I often think that if you go into films like this, it might also pique your interest to find out more about the history and go, okay, so I want to look into it about that. So I think actually you can go into these films without having too much of the context around France's history.
Ukraine, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with Zoe. I do think, however, if you are the kind of person that is going to kind of flip them off as just violence and sex and nothing more, then maybe, yeah, it would help to educate yourself on the culture that they're emerging from. Much the same as a lot of critics kind of did the same with the American torture porn and just kind of flipped it off. The same as we were talking about August Underground as well yesterday, and not realizing that they are a product of the cultural, the socio-political movements of the time. And so, yeah, I think if you're going to be dismissive of New French Extremity and not actually look to what's behind it, then yeah, I would say educate yourself on the historical context. But like Zoe said, if you are going to appreciate them, then you don't need to.
Kaz, any differing opinions or thoughts on that?
No, I would kind of agree with what's been said. I mean, like a film like Frontiers, it might help if you just have a basic understanding that France was a former Nazi-occupied state. But by the same token, they're not indigenous people movies. You know, films like with the Frontiers, when they're touching all the Muslim population, the film doesn't seek to kind of hammer that home. It's just part of the kind of landscape of the movie. So I think having a basic understanding might be helpful. But at the same time, like Zoe said, you watch these films and you learn. You're like, the opening segment of Frontiers makes you question, okay, why are people rioting? What was happening in Paris in the 90s at the time this film was set? And like Zoe said, you go online, you go on Google, you do a bit of research. And it might enrich it from a second viewing experience, maybe. Maybe go do a bit of reading and then watch a film a second time around, knowing that kind of historical, socio-political context. But I don't think it's a given. It's not necessary.
Thank you. Okay, we had somebody else chime in for another question for you folks. So Vinny, hello. Hello, Vinny. First of all, thank you very much for covering New French Extremity. Of course, love it. What would you say stands out the most to you about films in this movement? Zoe, I'll start with you.
That's a good question. I think what kind of stands out to me the most is probably their take on violence. It's very unflinching and it's very real. It's also often set in very kind of like real world settings that you can really imagine. It's not like fantastical, for instance, you know. It's very much, these are things that could potentially happen to anyone in an everyday setting, which is far more frightening to me anyway, far more frightening to me than, you know, like demons or ghosts or anything like that. Like, these are potential scenarios. I mean, God forbid if something like Martyrs happened, you know, I mean, but it's these things could potentially happen, and they could happen to anyone. And I think it makes the film so relatable, and that you can be very empathetic towards the characters. And I think because a lot of the new French Extremity films do have these strong female characters, that as a female watcher that I can identify with and empathize with, it's like they have such a strong connection. And they're also, you know, stylistically, they look fantastic, but they're just, you know, a slaughterhouse of blood. There's carnage, like they're very, very dirty, but at the same time very clean and sleek. You know, if you think of like Gaspar Noé, as you mentioned, Kaz, like Irreversible, that film in my head is like grimy and disgusting,
Yeah.
but it's not, because it looks beautiful. And I feel like I get that from the aesthetics of lots of new French Extremity films.
Ukraine, what would you say stands out the most to you about new French Extremity?
The nihilism of it. Even though, you know, we see final girls like Yasmin from Frontiers, it doesn't feel like a happy ending. And
Yeah,
I know this sounds really bad of me, but
Yep.
sometimes I don't want a happy ending. You know, life isn't one big happy ending, unfortunately. Like, and I think new French Extremity really reflects that, you know, when people go through trauma, it's not sunshine, daisies, and unicorns at the end of it. You've still got a big journey and a long way to go. So I think that's something I really enjoy reflected in new French Extremity.
Thank you. And Kaz, and then we'll wrap everything up. What would you say stands out the most to you?
Just what Ingrain said about the hopelessness aspect. And again, I don't think it's really prudent for people discussing these type of films to have a sunshine, happy rainbow kind of ending, because real life isn't like that. But also, what stands out for me with French Extreme is the relatability. As sad as that sounds, like being a queer female, lower working class, you know, kind of shitty background, it's like, oh, other people in the world exist like this, and the other people in the world who exist like this, who are depicted in these films, are female and are flawed and they're weird and they're queer and they're poor, and their politics don't align with the kind of zeitgeist of the status quo, and that's awesome. Like, to have that kind of heroism depicted, these women going through stuff that you can't even imagine and coming out the other end kind of baptized. That I can't think of another genre it does rape revenge or female rage in quite the same way, and that's what stands out for me. Yeah.
Thank you so much for all of your insight, your opinions, your thoughts, your feelings. It has been an amazing discussion. So we'll wrap it up. It's about that time. So again, thank you to my guests for coming in and talking about our favorite thing, new French Extremity. And again, I'm going to plug this for the 4,000th time, but Frontiers, Zoe and I did the audio commentary for it. It is available now from Second Sight Films, which is a UK company. This is a region B movie. It is not region free, so you need a region free or all region player to play this. I say that because Jess bought a copy and I was like, you don't have a region free player. But now she has to buy one so she can listen to my stupid voice. So thank you again to all of my guests today, and as well as Jessica behind the scenes again as my tech gremlin. I hope to see you all back here today at 4 p.m. Eastern time for the last panel of this year's Visceral Pleasure and Extreme Cinema on the sadness from 2022. But until then, folks, stay grim.
Thank you so much.